Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Public Library, and it's so nice to have you all with us tonight. Tina McAndrew from the Randall Library in Stowe is also with us. Tina, you want to get us started?
Sure. As Sally said, I'm from the Randall Library in Stowe, and I'm thrilled that Sally reached out again this week to partner with a program tonight. I want to thank the Randall Library Friends for supporting our programming as always. Without their support, we have very limited programming, so we're thrilled that they help us out all the time. So again, thank you to Sally, and we're really looking forward to this talk by Ted tonight.
And likewise, I would like to thank our wonderful friends of the Maynard Public Library. They support so very much of what we do, and we couldn't do it without them. It's our pleasure tonight to welcome Ted Reinstein to speak. We can't have spring training games yet, so maybe someday, but we can learn about the stories that led up to one of the seminal moments of Major League Baseball history. A few technical issues. We are recording tonight. And in terms of asking questions, if you're comfortable using the chat, feel free to type your questions into the chat as we go along. In the Q&A session, we will invite people to unmute themselves if they're more comfortable doing that. We do have the transcription enabled, so if you'd like to have captions, you can use that function in Zoom. Okay. All right, let's get started.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sally. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to both the Maynard and the Stowe and the Randall Library in Stowe, and to their friends at both libraries. I always say the public libraries, I count myself as a huge, passionate lover and ally of public libraries, and they can never have enough good friends, but never more so than these days over the last 2 years, for sure. So we're inching our way back toward in-person programming. So who knows, maybe next time we'll be able to do this in person. But thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to talk to you about my newest book tonight, Before Brooklyn, which is all about the people who came before a lifelong hero of mine, who's Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson, I promise you, will make a triumphant appearance by the end of our story. But the story begins really before Jackie Robinson, although I do like to begin with this question, because I love to do this question in person, because then I can ask people for a show of hands, and I can get people in person to give me some guesses to the answer to this question, which is, after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, who became the second African-American major league ball player? And I get all kinds of great answers, good guesses, but none of them right. Not yet, anyway. I've never had the right answer, because it's a bit of a trick question. Because the answer to the question, who was the second African-American major league ball player after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, is Jackie Robinson. Because Jackie Robinson, contrary to, I think, what is the vastly popular public conception of what he did, Jackie Robinson did not integrate Major League Baseball. He reintegrated Major League Baseball. Moses Fleetwood Walker, more than 60 years earlier, integrated Major League Baseball, right? So already we've probably just learned something, right? The fact that Jackie Robinson was not the first Black Major League ball player. And what makes that so important is that for those who tried to break the color barrier for those 60 plus years between Moses Fleetwood Walker and Jackie Robinson, when the color barrier existed, their whole argument was, we're not trying to do something new. We're not trying to do something different for baseball. We're trying to do something that had already been done, because indeed, when baseball was in its infancy, baseball was an outlier, believe it or not. So here's the next thing you may not have known, that when baseball begins in the 1870s, well, it begins slightly before the 1870s, it begins really in earnest in the decade or two right after the Civil War. Major League Baseball was formed in the 1870s. And baseball grows and mushrooms all over the country. This is the era when the term national pastime is first coined. And mind you, it is about describing something that had never existed before. There had never been a major league sport. Major League Hockey doesn't exist. Major League Football doesn't exist. Basketball hasn't even been invented really by that point yet, just beginning. So Major League Baseball as a countrywide, nationally shared sport is something entirely new, unprecedented. And it really sums up a feeling that this new national pastime was something that could perhaps help bind the wounds of the nation. Don't forget, the first 2 decades when baseball is formed, the 2 decades after the Civil War. The country has literally torn itself in two for the previous 5 years. So this national pastime, which is now being shared by all sections of the country, ironically, Major League Baseball grows fastest in the South, right? In the area where Reconstruction, the landscape is literally being reconstructed after being destroyed in the Civil War. So the national pastime is seen as something that is both fascinating, unprecedented, but also a bit of a balm, right? A bit of a salve for a country that is trying to bind up its wounds, right? And it's integrated. So not only is it something that is now being shared by all of America, it is something that actually looks a bit like all of America, which is to say, it wasn't all white. Now, it was all male, for that matter, Major League Baseball still is, but it was integrated, which made baseball something really of an outlier. It really was, because almost nothing else in American society was. And Major League Baseball was. People like Bud Fowler, perhaps the single most impassioned African-American ball player of the early era. His story is fascinating, it's exciting, it's inspiring, and then it's heartbreaking altogether. But so is the experience of all of these early black ball players, like Frank Grant, first African-American ball player from Massachusetts, the first professional black ball player from Massachusetts, from the Berkshires, and most famous of all, the Walker brothers. Moses Fleetwood sitting in that far left seat in the middle row, and his younger brother, Weldy, standing in the center in the back. They were teammates briefly at the Oberlin, Ohio college baseball team in 1881. Moses Fleetwood Walker is the most important early black ball player, not only because he's the first black to play Major League Baseball. He literally is he's first of all, he's the first standout, bona fide star black ball player. And he transforms an entire position of the sport, catcher. So prior to Moses Fleetwood Walker, the catcher, this is also the period of time when the term backstop is coined. What does it mean? You know, today we talk of a backstop on a ball field. Generally, we're talking about a physical structure, right? The backstop that forms that V behind home plate. Not always the case. Early days of baseball was often played in cow pastures and open fields, right? And there was no backstop as we think of it, but the catcher was called the backstop because that was their job. Catcher prior to Moses Fleetwood Walker was the least skilled player, the least talented player on your team. That's where you would stick the absolute worst guy on the team to be the backstop. And I'm sure more than one of them was told in no uncertain terms by their teammates, listen, you have one job. Just don't let the ball fall away off the field and delay the game. That's your only job. Just stop it, right? Moses Fleetwood Walker changed all that. He was what we would call today a five-tool player. He had talent in every facet of the game. He was fast. He was a good defense, good offense. He could hit with power, and he could throw. First catcher to ever throw someone out trying to steal a base. First catcher to wear a face mask. First catcher to wear shin guards. First catcher to wear a chest protector, and first catcher to call the pitches out to the pitcher, what pitch that he wants thrown. So he was so good that he was signed in 1884 by a Major League Baseball team. No longer today at Toledo, Ohio, but Toledo, Ohio at that time, the Blue Stockings were a Major League Baseball team. And in 1884, Moses Fleetwood Walker was signed by the Blue Stockings and started the season as their starting catcher in 1884. This was a landmark event. This was an event that many Americans saw as a deeply, deeply reassuring moment in American history. Why? Look at the date, 1884. Just about exactly 20 years from the end of the Civil War, from emancipation, from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, right? 20 years later, this national pastime that is helping rebind the nation's wound presents its first Black player whose parents had been born as slaves. So this was seen as something that really, really was a promising moment for a nation that was trying to come back together. Sadly, it was not seen as a promising moment by everybody. And unfortunately, one of those who saw it as anything but a promising moment was actually someone with a very, very large influence on the young sport of Major League Baseball, Cap Anson. Cap Anson was the captain of the Chicago Cubs. Chicago Cubs were the marquee Major League team of the era. They were like the New York Yankees of early baseball. They were the team that people came out to see, and Cap Anson was the player they wanted to see. Cap Anson was the first bona fide superstar of young Major League Baseball. Think of Ted Williams, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron. That was Cap Anson. He was an amazing hitter. Incredibly, so this is what they call the dead ball era. What does that mean? That was the period before balls were wound by machines. Today, they bounce like a super ball. You take a baseball today and bounce it on the ground, it will bounce back up to your hand. Not the case then. These balls are then wound by hand. They are they don't have a cork center. They don't go very far. And yet, Cap Anson, nonetheless, was a solid home run hitter. To this day, which I think is most remarkable of all, to this day, Cap Anson still holds 2 or 3 batting records for the Chicago Cubs. So none of that can be taken away from Cap Anson. You know what else can't be taken away from Cap Anson? He was also an unrepentant racist. He was a vicious bully, and he had a really foul mouth to match. And Cap Anson did not fancy playing against a team that fielded a Black ball player in Moses Fleetwood Walker. So Cap Anson makes his feelings known. Boy, does he. First of all, he plays the game under protest. Then he files an official grievance with Major League Baseball. And he informs them that going forward, the Chicago Cubs will no longer play against any team that fields a Black ball player. He routinely used a different word. You get the idea. So the Major League owners have to seriously consider this threat from the Chicago Cubs. Because as we said, the Chicago Cubs are the team that more than any other team puts people in the seats wherever they play. So in the summer of 1887 in Buffalo, New York, the owners of Major League Baseball meet to discuss what to do about Cap Anson's threat for the Cubs not to play. And here's how they respond. They agree that going forward, he won't have to worry about it because African Americans will no longer be signed to major or minor league contracts. It became known as the Gentleman's Agreement. Gentleman's Agreement because while it may have been very gentlemanly among these guys who were nodding and winking and shaking hands in a dark, closed up room, there was never anything transparent about it and never will be. There are no notes from the meeting, no transcript, no recorded vote. And following this landmark vote, no one ever came out to answer any questions or ever did answer any questions about the agreement. Nonetheless, it was a reality. The color barrier was now a reality. Blacks were barred from playing Major League Baseball. No more Black ball players would be signed to major or minor league contracts. Those that were already under existing contracts, like Moses Fleetwood Walker, would be allowed to play out their contracts, but that was it. The color barrier was now a reality. You know, I mentioned that for a player like Bud Fowler, who was probably one of the most impassioned of the early Black ball players, his story is exciting and inspiring and extraordinary, because this was a young man who seemed to live to play baseball. Literally. He literally played baseball almost year round. He would circumnavigate the hemisphere, right? So he could play baseball in the middle of the winter in the southern hemisphere and then come back up north for the fall and the summer. And now he was no longer able to do the single thing that seemed to give his life meaning, purpose. He was no longer able to play baseball. And a couple of times starting here, I'm going to read from my book and go back to the talk, and I think you'll follow along, no problem. He died of a blood disorder in Frankfort, New York in 1913. He was only 55. His unmarked grave told not a word of a truly extraordinary life. For years since the color barrier began to spread in 1887, Fowler had relentlessly fought for a place in organized baseball. Along with the other early Black professional players, he continued to try and play in the shadow of the descending barrier as teams shed Black ball players and refused to sign more. Fowler had uncommon talent, there's no question about it, but often it seemed that his greatest skill was in seeming to just somehow doggedly outrun the inescapable end, as if he simply willed himself to persevere, to compete and play, and even excel in an increasingly hostile landscape that, move about as he might, now seemed to expel him at shorter and shorter intervals. In Michigan in 1895, Bud Fowler was finally out of options. They all were, but Bud Fowler had outlasted all the others. He was literally the last Black man standing in baseball. My skin is against me, Fowler wrote in 1895. If I had not been quite so Black, who knows? I might have been able to catch on as a Spaniard or something of that kind. My Black skin, it just bars me. I'm done. Now, as the 20th century unfolded, it barred them all. The color barrier was complete. It would take another 50 years of fierce Fowler-like will and determination to break through again. So now, with the color barrier complete in 1887, we're into the 1890s. And what's significant about the 1890s, both in American history and for this story, is that this is now the period where segregation is now not only widespread, but state sanctioned, right? Because this is the period that kicks off with Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Which I know you remember from your high school history, is a Supreme Court decision that initially okayed segregation on transportation in two southern states, Alabama and Louisiana, but then was used to allow segregation everywhere in America, in everything. It was the separate but equal, which is what the Supreme Court argued they were doing, making things separate but equal. Half of that, of course, was always true. It was always separate, never equal. And it's the period where Jim Crow not only creeps into American life, but basically takes over. Segregation is now pervasive with Plessy versus Ferguson. And now it doesn't matter whether you're talking about baseball, whether you're talking about education, the workplace, it doesn't matter. Whether you're talking about, or as in this case, which side of the room you wait for a train on, it doesn't matter. Everything is now segregated, including baseball. It had been an outlier. It had been integrated. Baseball is no longer an outlier. Major League Baseball is now as segregated as any other facet of American life. So the other thing that's important to remember, though, is, and this is, like knowing about that baseball was integrated, this is one of those misconceptions, I think, about African Americans and professional baseball, is that while Blacks were barred from playing Major League Baseball during the period of the color barrier, they never stopped playing baseball, and they never stopped playing professional baseball at a very high level, right? So even during this period where the color barrier doesn't allow Blacks to play Major League Baseball, Blacks continue to play in their own barnstorming leagues. There were even attempts at creating more organized official leagues, but very few of them take. But there are great Black barnstorming teams, many of them good enough to beat Major League teams, which they play all the time, but they cannot play in the Major Leagues. And this is a period that it is, I think it's almost difficult for us now to imagine what that felt like. If you were a player like Rube Foster. Rube Foster was the first great Black pitcher. He stood fearsome presence on the mound, about 6'3", 245 pounds. He was a very intimidating pitcher and presence. And he was an amazing pitcher. So he played for a barnstorming team, the Chicago Giants, and they routinely played white Major League teams. And frequently they beat them. So you have a guy like Rube Foster who is so good that he is told by a legendary Major League pitcher like Christy Mathewson that it's too bad, Mathewson told him, it's too bad that your skin's the wrong color, which is what he said, because otherwise you could play on any Major League team you wanted to. So that was cold comfort for a proud guy like Rube Foster. And Rube Foster, even though he knew that there was nothing he could do about playing in the Major Leagues, he became determined that, as he put it, whites can keep us from playing in the Major Leagues, but they can't keep us from creating our own elite league. And that was his philosophy behind the Negro Leagues. And Rube Foster is the father of the Negro Leagues, which is the reason he's also called the father of black baseball. And in the winter of 1920, in Kansas City, Missouri, Rube Foster succeeds in creating the Negro Leagues, the single most significant and vital unsung hero in the entire saga of breaking the color barrier. Without the Negro Leagues, look, would the color barrier have fallen eventually? Yes. I mean, the color barrier would have fallen eventually. It would not have fallen in 1945 or 1947. Listen, in 1945 and 1947, public transportation was still segregated all over America and would be for another 15, almost 20 years. And the same thing, I am convinced, would have been the case with Major League Baseball. But the Negro Leagues changed that because the Negro Leagues created a showcase, not for blacks. Blacks knew that there were these amazingly talented black ball players because they were coming out to see them, and they could see, and they knew that these players could play on major league teams. It was whites who didn't know that. It was whites who needed to come face to face with great ball players like Pops Lloyd and Judy Johnson and Oscar Charleston, one of the greatest fielders in all time. Cool Papa Bell, arguably the fastest human being to have ever played baseball. And by the way, in that very first class of major league owners, I do want to draw your attention to somebody who's going to come up again and again in this story, no more so than right at the end with Jackie Robinson, and that's J.L. Wilkinson. J.L. Wilkinson is sitting in the front row, just on the far left, in the front row, and he is the only white owner in the entire history of the Negro Leagues. And I don't point that out, as some kind of racial peculiarity. I point that out because there is a straight line between J.L. Wilkinson in that photograph and 25 years right down the line in a straight path to Jackie Robinson, because J.L. Wilkinson, who was the owner of the Kansas City Monarchs, one of the 2 or 3 most legendary Negro League teams, is the owner who will sign Jackie Robinson to his first professional baseball contract. And then it will only be 6 months until Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier. So these players remind people, show people just what the Negro Leagues are made of. And the Negro Leagues in their first decade of play in the 1920s take off. Their explosive level of growth, mushrooming growth all over America, replicates the explosive growth of Major League Baseball. And it looks like the sky's the limit for the Negro Leagues. They go from 18 teams to 26 teams. They separate. They have enough teams to separate into a Negro National League, Negro American League. They have the first of 2 Negro League World Series. And it looks like the growth will just continue on and on. And it might well have. But unfortunately, as the first decade of the Negro Leagues came to an end, growth also came to an end all over America, where the roof fell in on everyone because of the Great Depression. So by 1929 into 1930, you have the Great Depression. I think sometimes today we forget just how cataclysmic the Great Depression really was. Maybe some of you have relatives or parents who grew up during the Depression. I know I grew up hearing stories from my late dad about he was 10, 11 years old in the worst years of the Depression, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33. And I grew up hearing those stories. A quarter of all Americans unemployed. You know how bad it was in minority communities. Flip that, right? So 25% unemployment nationally. In minority communities, it was frequently over 70%. Because this period of the growth of the Negro Leagues through the teens and the 20s is also the period of the Great Migration, which is the period of the greatest number of Black Americans leaving the American South to cities in the North and the Midwest in search of better jobs, higher paying jobs, better quality of life for themselves and their family. And the good news is they found that in cities from Denver to Boston. They found that. Unfortunately, because of the timing, they were almost always among the most recently hired. So what happens when you lay people off? Last hired, first fired. And in minority communities like Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, minority unemployment was over 70%. In those first early years of the Depression, over 30,000 businesses going under every year, including the Negro Leagues, up in smoke. Listen, if you're trying to cobble together a few bucks to be able to cover your mortgage or your rent, to put some food in front of your kids, you're not buying baseball tickets. So the Negro Leagues, which depended entirely on ticket revenues and some slender lines of credit from Black-owned banks, also up in smoke. So the Negro Leagues fold. except for one team, which we'll get to. Negro Leagues fold. So you might wonder how many major league teams survived the Great Depression, because every single one of the 16 then major league teams, each one of them was a thriving American business, but not so many went out of business. Because the major leagues at that time, look, today for major league teams, now not just baseball, whatever major league sport you're talking about, you can sometimes be talking about 200 million is a steal now for a major league team. So somebody's going to break the $1 billion mark soon. But at that time, major league teams did not cost that much. Nonetheless, it cost a lot of money, and all 16 major league teams. Today, you'll have consortiums of investors who have that kind of money, because not a lot of people can shell out $700, $800 million. But at that time, all 16 major league teams were owned by a wealthy white owner, like the Boston Red Sox, which were owned by Tom Yawkey. Tom Yawkey, when he was 16 years old, came into $16.3 million. And about 5 years later, he came into $16 more million, and he bought the Boston Red Sox. But we're talking about how these major league teams were insulated from the worst effects of the Great Depression. They were insulated because of the wealth of their owners, right? Which was not the case at all in the Negro Leagues. Tom Yawkey, to give you a sense of this wealth, Tom Yawkey was a relative pauper in comparison to some of his fellow owners. We talked about the Chicago Cubs. Chicago Cubs at that time were owned by a guy named Phil Wrigley. Phil Wrigley had a little chewing gum business going on. St. Louis Cardinals were owned by a guy named Gussie Busch. Gussie Busch was brewing a little beer. So the major league teams insulated, they all managed to stay afloat. I did say there was one Negro League team that also managed to stay afloat, and that brings us back to the Kansas City Monarchs and our friend J.L. Wilkinson. So J.L. Wilkinson was an extraordinary guy. He was someone who seemed to have no racial prejudice, no bias whatsoever. It was such that it was almost disarming to many of his young black ball players, many of who had come from deeply, deeply segregated racist areas in the South, and they had never met a white like JL. And he was beloved by his players. And he told his players when the Depression hit that if you huddle together and stay with me, I will try to keep the team afloat and not lay anybody off. We'll try to keep everybody paid. He told them up front, the only way we're going to be able to do this is to play baseball literally pretty much year round. And that's what they did. Here they are barnstorming through Canada in the summer of 1933, 34. And I thought of J.L. Wilkinson this past fall, because this past fall, somebody died who reminded me of him. This past fall, Aaron Feuerstein died. And Aaron Feuerstein, to refresh your memory, was the owner of Malden Mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And in 1992, you may recall that the Malden Mills burned down. And Aaron Feuerstein refused to lay off his workers. Even though they had no job, they had no place to work. He kept them all on payroll until the mills were rebuilt. And that's essentially what J.L. Wilkinson did in the 1930s. And I thought of him when Aaron Feuerstein died. But J.L. couldn't have continued to do that forever. He couldn't have continued to do it forever. So fortunately for him, believe it or not, the Negro Leagues are reborn. And what makes this remarkable is when the Negro Leagues come back to life at a time when nothing was coming back to life. They come back to life at a time when things were dying. The depths, the worst years of the Great Depression. So it's completely counterintuitive. It's also where they come back to life in Pittsburgh, which was among the cities in America. Pittsburgh, the home of manufacturing and steel, one of the hardest hit cities in the entire nation, the world in many ways. This is where baseball comes to life. And the Negro Leagues, and the only reason they do is because of these two guys. And they are both men, as you can see. They're both African-American. That's where the similarities end. Because you are looking, what makes this story so incredible is that you are looking at two lifelong arch enemies. These two guys hated each other. And the only thing they ever worked together on, the only thing they ever cooperated on and talked together about was the importance of bringing the Negro Leagues back to life. And that became, in some ways, their legacy, which I'm sure they roll over in their graves about because they did not like each other. And they couldn't have been more different. Composey Jr. Grew up as the son of a pioneering Black figure in Pittsburgh, a fabulously successful pioneering Black civil engineer, and became a successful businessman. I'm sure he had hoped that his young son would follow him into the family business. But Composey Jr. was a sports fanatic, basketball and baseball wins out. And in the late 1920s, he's approached about would he consider saving a legendary Black ball club in Pittsburgh, the Homestead Grays. The Homestead Grays were going to fold if somebody didn't buy them and take over. And Cumberland Posey Jr. agrees to take over the Homestead Grays. And he turns out to be a skilled baseball strategist and a great coach, great manager. He turns out to be a really inspiring motivator of young Black men. And, well, don't take my word for it. How good was Cumberland Posey as a manager and a coach? And how much did he inspire his ball players? Well, in his first season with the Homestead Grays, they only went on to have the most successful season that any baseball team anywhere on the face of Mother Earth ever had. The 1931 Homestead Grays won 143 games. Let me put that into some context for you, okay? So today, Major League Baseball plays 162 games. At that time, Major League Baseball played only 154 games. The Homestead Grays won 143 on their own against only 29 losses. They were incredible. And as I say, most baseball historians today count them fabulously more talented, deeper at every position than even the 1927 Yankees, which is often the Major League gold standard for the greatest season any baseball club has ever had. But his arch nemesis, Gus Greenlee, was determined to try to outdo him. And he almost did. Totally different story with Gus Greenlee. Gus Greenlee, Pittsburgh, goes off to fight in World War I. He's wounded in the Battle of Verdun, decorated, comes back to Pittsburgh. Depths of both the Great Depression and Prohibition, so you can't even buy a drink to drown your sorrows. Guy has to figure out some way to make a living. He cobbles some money together. He buys a rickety old car, figures I'll be a one-man taxi cab company, and he does. Guy's approached by someone representing the Latrobe Brewing Company. Does that name sound familiar? Well, you might know it today as the brewers of Rolling Rock beer. But nobody was brewing beer in the Depression and the Prohibition. Well, at least not legally. But these guys were. And they needed somebody to drive their bootleg liquor to all those speakeasies around Pittsburgh. And a guy approaches Gus Greenlee one day and he says, "Pal, how would you like a job driving our bootleg hooch around the city?" And Gus Greenlee says, "Last time I checked, my friend, that was illegal and I'm not fixing to get arrested." And the guy says, "Yeah, no, that's a point. I totally get your point." He said, "Can I ask you a question?" He said, "How much money have you made? What's the most money you've made one day driving cab?" And Gus Greenlee thought about it for a moment and he said, "I don't know, maybe the best day ever, I don't know, $9 or $10. And the guy says, "I'll tell you what, why don't you multiply that by 10 and we'll do a trial week. And if it works out the second week with us, you can multiply that by 20. And a year later, you can multiply it by 50. And Gus Greenlee stopped him and he said, "When do I start?" And he did, and he never looked back, and he never worked another honest day the rest of his life. Gus Greenlee was a crook. He was a gambler. He got into gambling, loan sharking, laundering money, running the numbers, you name it. He did it. He became fabulously wealthy. The guy was making $20,000 a month during some of the worst years of the Depression. But he was a complicated crook because he was also a beloved figure in the Hill District, the Black section of Pittsburgh. He was very much seen as a Robin Hood figure because Gus Greenlee took care of people all over the Black neighborhood of Pittsburgh. It was legendary. It was simply understood that if you got into trouble, if your kid was sick, if you had a doctor bill you couldn't pay, if you couldn't pay the rent, couldn't pay the mortgage, all you had to do was get out word to Gus's people. And the white envelope would slide under the door like magic. Every Christmas, everybody knew in the Hill District, all you do was open up your door at Christmas Day, and there it was, a big wicker baskets with a big Christmas dinner, courtesy of Gus Greenlee. So he was kind of beloved in the Hill District, but he was a crook. but he was a crook. He started a jazz club, the Crawford Grill, which was sort of a jazz mecca. It was seen as a melting pot. Everybody was welcome at the Crawford Grill. White, black, didn't matter. And you name the jazz great of that era, Count Basie, Ellington, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, they all played the Crawford Grill. And just like Composey, Gus Greenlee was approached about saving another ball club in Pittsburgh. And he agrees. He agrees. Of course, I think he also, unlike Composey, who was a baseball fanatic, I don't think Gus Greenlee was a baseball fanatic, not early on, but he did see both the jazz club and a ball club as great ways to launder some of his dirty money. So he buys the club and he renames them to help promote his new jazz club, the Pittsburgh Crawfords, and he names the club the Pittsburgh Crawfords after the Crawford Grill. And a year after his arch enemy, Composey, wins 143 games in 1932, the Pittsburgh Crawfords win almost 100 games. Now, he does that by doing what he does in almost everything else in life, which is to boost it, lift it, if you will, because he boosted off of the Homestead Grays two of his arch enemies' best players. If you look at the rear row there, the tallest guy standing in the rear row is a very promising young pitcher by the name of Satchel Paige. Satchel Paige, one of the most legendary names really in American history, certainly baseball, one of the half dozen greatest players to have ever played. He does end up playing Major League Baseball. The fellow standing next to him is a promising young slugging catcher by the name of Josh Gibson, who is also one of the greatest players to have ever lived, white or black. And they are boosted by their owner. And these two guys, Gus Greenlee and Composey, make a career out of this. They will continually poach each other's best players the rest of their careers, sometimes at the start of the season, sometimes during the season, and in one celebrated instant in the same inning. Not sure how that worked, but they did. There's no overstating the significance to Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson. They are not only the two most famous Negro League ball players, they are among the most famous and greatest ball players, black or white, in baseball history, but they also completely changed the nature of how whites, not blacks, don't forget, blacks saw these players breaking in as rookies. They knew from day one how good they were. Whites, let's say in Boston, had no idea who Satchel Paige was for decades into his career. Okay, so it was when these two players came into their own, when they became the standout stars of the Negro Leagues, that's when whites began to come to Negro League games. That is what will shift the entire perspective for whites. That's what was important. Don't forget, it wasn't blacks that created the color barrier. So it's going to have to be whites, especially fans, and pressure coming from them, because when they saw players like Satchel Paige, one of the greatest pitchers to have ever lived, and they saw Josh Gibson, one of the greatest hitters to have ever lived, they weren't just saying, like the early black ball players, Oscar Charleston, Pumper Bell, et cetera, wow, these guys could play on any major league team. No, now it changed. Now it was, how come my major league team can't get Satchel Paige, can't get Josh Gibson? That changed the dynamic. By the way, Josh Gibson is not as famous as Satchel Paige because, frankly, he just wasn't the bigger-than-life figure that Satchel Paige was. Satchel Paige was constantly saying things that were quotable. He was a colorful figure, very outgoing, bigger than life. Josh Gibson, very shy, retiring, soft-spoken, let his hitting speak for him. Nonetheless, it's important to remember what a great ball player he was. Arguably hit the longest home run ever hit in Yankee Stadium. And he was known, even in his playing days, universally as the Black Babe Ruth. Funny story. Shortly before he finished playing, Josh Gibson met the real-life Babe Ruth. And Babe Ruth threw his big, meaty arm around Josh Gibson, as he liked to do, and he shook him a little bit like he liked to do. And he said, "Mr. Gibson, what an honor. Hey, I understand they call you the Black Babe Ruth. How about that?" And Josh Gibson said in his very quiet, squeaky voice, "Mr. Ruth, with all due respect, my people call you the White Josh Gibson. How about that?" So how do we know so much about the Negro Leagues? This is an important question. not just rhetorical, because I'm going to answer it, because the answer has everything to do with why the color barrier eventually fell. How do we know so much about the Negro Leagues? There are entire libraries. I guarantee you at the Randolph Library in Stowe, I guarantee you at Maynard's Public Library, there are, and I know Sally and Sarah could bear this out, there are shelves full of books about baseball history and the Negro Leagues. I've read dozens of those books, okay? There was never at any time in the entire history of the Negro Leagues any white mainstream newspaper that assigned a single dedicated reporter to covering the Negro Leagues. Not even one reporter to cover the leagues as a whole. Never happened. So if the white press never covered the Negro Leagues, how do we know so much about the history, rich in stats and data and so forth? The black press. And the black press, second only to the Negro Leagues, is the second most vital unsung hero in the saga of breaking the color barrier, because it is the black press that focused attention first only to black readers and then to white readers as well on the fact that the color barrier was still existing by the 1930s, the 1940s, when people tended to forget about it. You know, we think of it today as something that was this awful thing, and it was, it's baseball's original sin. But we think of it today as something that existed for this period of time, you know, way back when. Jackie Robinson comes along and breaks the color barrier, and all is good again. You know, the fact that the color barrier existed was bad enough. But for 60 plus years, people accepted it. People accepted it. And it was an obscenity, and people accepted it. So it was the black press, not the white press. There were some people in the white press, as we're going to see, who would remind people that the color barrier existed. It was the black press, however, that raised the consciousness of people all over America to the fact that the color barrier still existed. Pioneering publishers like Robert Lee Vann, founder and publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier, greatest distribution of any black newspaper in American history. Robert Stengstack Abbott, founder and publisher of the Chicago Defender, another legendary black American black newspaper. These guys hired gifted sports writers like Wendell Smith and Sam Lacey. And these sports writers were the first writers, black or white, who wrote about these Negro League players as three-dimensional people, so that not just blacks, many of whom had already met these players in the Negro Leagues, but for whites to understand what it was like for these players to be living in a parallel universe, what it was like for a player of a stature, of talent, like Satchel Paige, who whites could see at Yankee Stadium, like he did on a day in 1930, when he struck out Joe DiMaggio 3 times. Only time in DiMaggio's entire career he struck out 3 times. They could see him. But it wasn't until Wendell Smith and Sam Lacey wrote about Satchel Paige that they had a fuller understanding of what it took to be Satchel Paige. And that, wow. So the day before Satchel Paige came into Yankee Stadium and struck out Joe DiMaggio 3 times, he had driven almost 300 miles on a rickety bus from Tuscaloosa up through Tennessee, Kentucky, where his team played 14 ball games in less than a week and a half prior to playing the Yankees a day later after that stretch, right? And still, he struck out Joe DiMaggio 3 times. This was the kind of thing that people were reading about for the first time, and it had an effect. It had an effect. Now, you might wonder, how were people reading about this all over America? Mind you, in the 1930s, you could read about Satchel Paige in the Pittsburgh Courier or the Chicago Defender, whether you were in Spokane, Washington, Bangor, Maine, Fort Worth, Texas, Miami, Florida, Phoenix, Arizona, San Francisco, California. How? Think about that for a moment. This is a real riddle. Think about that. These papers, the Courier, the Defender, these were hand-to-mouth operations. They operated on a shoestring. It was all they could do to make deadline 5 nights a week. And then all they could do to get their newspapers out and delivered to the newsstands just around, not the whole city. Whites weren't reading these papers. All they had to do was get the papers out to the newsstands in the black community. And it was still an effort, a struggle to do that 5 nights a week. How the hell were they getting their newspapers all over America? Here's how. The single most improbable ally in the entire story. This one blew me away. This one, I had no idea that this facet of the color barrier story existed. I had no idea until 3 years ago. And then I couldn't read enough about it. So the Pullman porters, right? Face of overnight train travel in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. You know what's interesting about, so working our way backward, the Pullman porters were the face of train travel in the golden age of American railroad, 20s, 30s, 40s. Negro Leagues, it's the golden age of black baseball through the Negro Leagues, 20s, 30s, 40s, excuse me. And it's also the golden age of the African-American press in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So the Pullman porters in that period, the golden age of train travel, are the face of overnight train travel in America. If you were traveling at that time on an overnight, Pullman porter would meet you at your track. They would show you to your seats. Later, they would show you to your berth, right? Turn down the covers, as this fellow's doing. They would keep track of who needed a wake-up call, which, of course, at that time was not a call, but a wake-up knock. So you may still be wondering, well, what do they have to do with baseball? And what do they have to do with the color barrier? Here's what. So imagine that these two early black publishers, right, were pioneering publishers. They were also incredibly ingenious, creative promoters of their newspapers. They were all about increasing the distribution of their newspapers however they possibly could. And in the Pullman porters, they saw an ally that, however unlikely, could be absolutely indispensable. But they had to get them involved. So they made outreach to Pullman porters. They didn't need every Pullman porter running on a train. Sometimes there might have been 12 or 14 Pullman porters working on a run from, say, Boston or the Zephyr out of Chicago to Denver. They didn't need all of them. They only needed one. They only needed one on a run, right? But they needed them to agree to deliver black newspapers, an offense for which any single one of them would have been fired on the spot. But they never were, because they figured out a great way to do it. So here's how it would work. Let's say a train was going to leave Boston South Station and make a run down the Eastern Seaboard. It's going to go out of Boston. It's going to go through Penn Station, New York. It's going to go through Philly, Washington, Chattanooga, all the way down to Miami, right? Pullman porters were also part of provisioning trains. Food, right? So let's say they had to deal with a black bakery to deliver the bread. Black bakery in Mattapan, Forest Hills, Roxbury, Dorchester, and Boston. A little truck comes up to the track. South Station. The little truck in the back of the truck has about 4 or 5 big 5-foot wicker baskets with the bread. Underneath the bread are bundles of newspapers, the black newspapers of Boston, the Boston Guardian, the Boston Recorder, the Boston Chronicle at that time. They take off, right? Penn Station, New York. They offload Boston's black newspapers. They unload the Amsterdam News out of New York. They get to Baltimore. They offload the Amsterdam News from New York. They take on the Baltimore Afro-American. And they do that all the way down the East Coast. And they're doing that on every train all around America. So that in 1939, you have the extraordinary dynamic where you could find, on some days, more easily find the Pittsburgh Courier on a newsstand in Seattle, Washington, than you could the New York Times. This is the legacy of the Pullman porters in helping to deliver black newspapers all over America. And by doing that, they were raising the consciousness of people all over America about the scourge of the color barrier and what's going to be done about it. And don't forget about it. So now we're up to 1940. Now we're up to 1940, and we are only 5 minutes and about 10 minutes away from the end of our story. And yet, we're only 5 minutes away from the color barrier falling, I should say, and the end of our story. So what's going to happen? Because in 10 minutes and 5 years, in 1940, Major League Baseball was no closer to dropping the color barrier than it was in 1930 or 1920 or 1910 or 1900. So what's going to happen? Well, another unlikely hero who is just as improbable as the Pullman porters, Lester Rodney in New York. So Lester Rodney is a gifted sports writer. He has an unusual platform, but he is a very unlikely ally. He's white, he's Jewish, he's a communist. Hey, nobody's perfect. He's writing for the communist newspaper of the American Communist Party. He would have written for anybody, but in 1938, the Daily Worker is launched by the American Communist Party. Well, it existed before, but they launched a sports section. And Lester Rodney gets the job. And Lester Rodney loves writing about baseball, hates the color barrier. And he is the first person who puts the color barrier question in the context of World War II, in the context of America going to war. As he reminds his readers with every one of his columns, America is going to war. Blacks as well as whites are being trained to fight in World War II. And blacks as well as whites will die and come home in boxes. And those that survive, those who are black and come home, will have just been asked to die if necessary for their country, a country to which they will return still as a second-class citizen, where they can't sit wherever they want on a bus and they can't play Major League Baseball. And that began to resonate in a whole new way. That began to strike millions of Americans as a bridge too far. Listen, the color barrier was never acceptable. But now, in the context of this question of asking young blacks to die for their country, but be okay with coming back to that country, we're a second-class citizen. And the Pittsburgh Courier took Lester Rodney's argument and they launched the Double V campaign to help black veterans sort of rationalize what was an anguishing and difficult situation, right? And they launched the Double V campaign, double victory. Double victory stood for first, go to Europe, fight for the Pacific, fight, defeat Adolf Hitler, come home, defeat Jim Crow. And that handkerchief, the Double V handkerchief that you see there, was given out for free by the Pittsburgh Courier. And it was worn in the sleeve and the jacket of every member of the Tuskegee Airmen, the most celebrated all-black unit in World War II. But it was another all-black unit in World War II that takes us to the end here, because the 761st Tank Battalion, although it's not nearly as famous as the Tuskegee Airmen, was much more a part of breaking the color barrier, mostly because its young lieutenant, one of its young officers in that inset picture, young lieutenant by the name of Jack Roosevelt Robinson. Jackie Robinson could not wait to ship out with the 761st and lead them into combat in Europe. And he almost made it, but not quite. Just before the 761st was set to disembark for Europe, Jackie Robinson flunked his final physical. He was a standout UCLA, All-American at UCLA, old football injury, found an injury that hadn't healed. He was not cleared for combat. He asked for special permission to go with the unit nonetheless as a special morale officer, denied. Said it was the most crushing disappointment of his life at that time. So the 761st ships out without Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson is crushed. Jackie Robinson is at Fort Hood in Texas, huge base, buses constantly circling the base, and he gets on one of these buses when he leaves the hospital, and he decides he's going to go get a drink at the Black Officers Club on Fort Hood. And he takes a seat on one of these buses in the front row right behind the driver. I don't think he wanted to have any trouble. He didn't expect to have any trouble, but then he knew something the bus driver probably didn't know, which was that about 48 hours earlier, President Roosevelt has signed an executive order forbidding segregation on transportation within domestic American military bases. So Jackie Robinson knew that he was okay to sit wherever he wanted, but the driver probably didn't know. That may not have cared. Either way, bus began to fill up with white passengers. Jackie Robinson was told to move to the back of the bus. He refused. Bus driver pulled over to a sentry post. A couple of MPs got on the bus. They arrested Jackie Robinson, handcuffed, taken off the bus. He is court-martialed for insubordination. Now, I don't know how many of you know that Jackie Robinson was once court-martialed. I'm going to guess that pretty much most of you do not know. There's a good reason for that. If Jackie Robinson had been court-martialed out of the Army, you would have never heard of Jackie Robinson's name, because he never would have been picked by Branch Rickey to break the color barrier. But Jackie Robinson beat the court-martial. So by 1944-45, he was out of the Army, honorably discharged, but he needed a job. So he wrote a letter to our old friend, J.L. Wilkinson of the Kansas City Monarchs. And he asked J.L. Wilkinson if he could try out for the Monarchs, because he knew that some standout black ball players had not yet returned from Europe. And J.L. wrote back to Jackie Robinson, and he said, Jackie Robinson, I know who you are. You don't have to try out for me. You got a job. So in the spring of 1945, Jackie Robinson breaks camp with the Kansas City Monarchs in his first Negro League season, infielder for the Kansas City Monarchs. And again, I don't know how many of you know this. I'm going to assume most of you do not, that only about 3 weeks from the time that this picture you're looking at was taken, Jackie Robinson will not be in Kansas City. He will be in Boston, where he will be trying out for the Boston Red Sox. That's true, because in Boston, at the same time Jackie Robinson is breaking camp with the Monarchs, the final battle to break the color barrier is about to be joined in Boston. It will fail, but it will win the war, ironically enough, because in Boston, at the same time Jackie Robinson is breaking camp with the Monarchs, Izzy Muchnick, a Jewish Boston city councilor, has been desperately trying to use Lester Rodney's argument for breaking the color barrier, right? That you can't ask blacks to have served in the army and come back and not be able to play Major League Baseball. But he's powerless. He's trying to find some way to force Major League teams to at least give a tryout to black ball players. And he's looking at the Red Sox and he's trying to figure out a way to force them to do it. And then he finds a way. He finds a way. He finds an old blue law. Remember those? That still existed in 1945. And it stipulated that Major League Baseball could not be played on a Sunday in Boston unless it had the unanimous consent of the Boston City Council. Well, Izzy Muchnick realized that he had leverage because he was, in fact, a city councilor. He lived, in fact, by something that in Judaism is called tikkun olam. Tikkun olam translates from the Hebrew verbatim as repair the world. And it is something that Jews are called upon to do in all walks of life. Repair the world wherever you can. Listen, you can offer somebody a kind word who needs a kind word at a down moment in their life, and that is repairing their world at that moment. But Izzy Muchnick realized he had a way to help repair the world in a bigger way, break the color barrier. So he fired off a letter to the brain trust of the Boston Red Sox. He asked them to please consider trying out some qualified black ball players. And Eddie Collins, the tall guy in that picture there, who was then the general manager of the Boston Red Sox, wrote him a cordial letter back. And he said, "My esteemed counselor, Muchnick, much as I would love to help you, it might interest you to know that in my entire tenure with the Boston Red Sox, we have never had a single inquiry from a single black ball player seeking employment with us. I can only conclude there isn't any interest, and therefore I don't see the point of having a tryout." Well, Izzy Muchnick was a bright guy, Harvard and Harvard Law. He was also absolutely inexhaustible and determined. Played golf at Harvard, ice hockey, no mask. So he wasn't put off when he realized that he was getting a load of you know what. So he fired off a cablegram about 3 weeks later, just before the vote was to be taken by the city council. And he said to Eddie Collins, general manager of the Red Sox, "Mr. Collins, it appears that you don't have any interest in trying out these ball players. And therefore, this letter should serve to inform you, I will be withholding my vote for the Red Sox to play Sunday baseball in 1945. Well, Eddie Collins understood this meant the Red Sox needed to have that tryout. That would have been absolutely financially devastating for the Red Sox. In 1945, this is pre-TV, baseball derives almost all of its revenue from ticket sales. Not only that, on Sunday in 1945, every single major league team plays a doubleheader every single Sunday. So the Red Sox would have been denied half their doubleheaders in 1945. Unthinkable. So they fire off a cablegram back to Izzy Muchnick and they say, fine, you can have the tryout. Three black ball players, be at Gate D, Fenway Park on the morning of April 12th, 1945. Well, Izzy Muchnick knew a lot about Boston's blue laws and zoning ordinances, et cetera, but he didn't know a lot about black baseball. So he consulted with our friend Wendell Smith of the Pittsburgh Courier for help in locating 3 qualified black ball players, and Wendell Smith came up with the 3. Wendell Smith, Sammy Jethro, and a promising young infielder out in Kansas City, Jackie Washington. And they trooped to Boston, all set to try out on April 12th, 1945. But on April 12th, 1945, history intervenes. Franklin Roosevelt dies. And all of America shuts down. No tryout. Now, 24 hours later, America starts to open up again. 48 hours later, America is completely opened up and back to normal. But curiously enough, at Fenway Park, they seem to be still deep in uncontrolled grief and mourning and can't have the tryout. Well, Red Sox were trying to play out the clock, run out the clock. and avoid having that tryout. And they almost made it. All they had to do was run out the clock for 2 more days. 2 more days. Because on the afternoon of April 16th, 1945, the Red Sox were scheduled to get a train at 1 o'clock out of Boston to New York, where they were scheduled to open up their 1945 season the next day, April 17th. But on the morning of April 16th, 1945, the story breaks by, curiously enough, a white sports writer, Dave Egan. And he puts it in the form of a letter on the front page, a letter to Boston sports fans. He says, "You may not be aware of this, Boston sports fans, but at this hour, there are 3 Negro players," as he put it, "in Boston who have been marooned in a hotel room for over a week. They have been promised a tryout by your Boston Red Sox, who are now reneging on their promise and are trying to skip town." Well, that was it. The Red Sox could see clearly they had to go ahead and hold the tryout, and they did. They called Izzy Muchnick. They told him to get the players over there, and they did. They arrived at 11 o'clock at Fenway Park on April 16th, 1945, and the 3 black ball players suited up. They took the field. They ran the bases, took some infield, took some batting practice, and about 45 minutes later, they were called off the field. The Red Sox thanked them very much. They were told they would be in touch. None of them ever heard from the Red Sox again the rest of their lives. But you know who was paying rapt attention that morning? A little bit south in Brooklyn Heights, New York? Branch Rickey, general manager, part owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was desperately afraid that morning that somehow Tom Yawkey was going to go ahead and upset his plans that had been in place for almost a year at that point to sign Jackie Robinson and break the color barrier. Now, in hindsight, we know we could have told Branch Rickey, "You got nothing to worry about because it's going to take Tom Yawkey another 14 years to break the color barrier." But Branch Rickey didn't know that. So only 6 months later, as you see in this picture, Branch Rickey signed Jackie Robinson, first to a minor league contract with the Dodgers, and then 2 years later, in 1947, on April 15th, almost 2 years to the day from his tryout, the sham tryout with the Red Sox, Jackie Robinson took the field at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, New York, wearing number 42, as he strode out to his position at first base. Amid the din of cheering fans, of broadcasters announcing history, and of exploding flashbulbs capturing it, there were also 2 inaudible sounds at Ebbets Field that day. They were sounds that could only be heard with the heart, not the ear, of a wall falling and of a cheering that wasn't present spiritually, but was present by those who were there spiritually, not physically. Moses Fleetwood Walker didn't live to see it. And by the time he died, broken, bitter, alcoholic, he couldn't even imagine it, but he was there. Bud Fowler tried his entire life to outrun the shadow of the descending wall that rose up to deny him at the end at every turn. In life, it seemed that he and his scuffed bat and well-worn mitt had been everywhere, anywhere. A black man desperately trying to just play baseball. Now, he was in Brooklyn. Even as they worked their regular shifts that day, some working their way on the rails west, south, north, some just a mile or less on the tracks from Ebbets, the Pullman porters who had ensured that those stories of black journalists reached readers all over America. They were there. The Negro Leagues, past and present, those who had come too early and those who were young enough now to imagine that they too might walk through that wall. They were there. And the African-American veterans of the war just ended and those who had given their lives in it, they were there. On this momentous day, a ball game was played before a crowd both present and cheering, and another crowd silent and unseen. They watched the game, and they watched the terrible wrong being finally righted. To be sure, even as a black ball player bounded onto an otherwise all-white field, racism was still alive and well in Brooklyn and clear on across America. So many other barriers remained in place. Many still are. But on this day, some of the hurt and humiliation was salved. On this day, hope and faith that had long seemed to have run out were finally redeemed. On this day, the long arc of the moral universe seemed to bend improbably toward Brooklyn, touching down on the grass and the dirt of a creaky old ballpark where the familiar white lines would no longer bar a black ball player. And in the bottom of the 7th inning, as you see, when Jackie Robinson laid down a perfect bunt and raced toward first base, he was not alone. That invisible crowd was suddenly right there, running right alongside, willing him on. And as Robinson sprinted safely onto second base and caught his breath, they exhaled with him. After all, it had been a long, uncertain 60-year journey, and they'd helped him get there. The next Dodger batter doubled. Jackie Robinson rounded third, and he was home. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm happy to take any questions. If anybody has any questions, I'll tell you what, I'm going to leave this. I'm going to leave this slide up, because if we were in person, I'd have a little table with my books. But if anybody would like to purchase any of my books, including Before Brooklyn, all you got to do is go to my website. If you would like to get a signed copy of a book, however, best to just shoot me an email. You got the email right there. Shoot me an email. I'll tell you in one email back how to get yourself a signed copy. I'll ship it for free. It'll be signed. There's no tax, none of which you'll be able to do on Amazon. Okay. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions anybody has.
Thanks, Ted. There not so many questions, but we do have some comments. Chris says there's a movie about Jackie Robinson's court martial.
42. Yes.
No, about his court-martial, the court-martial of Jackie
Oh, but it's
Robinson.
court-martial.
Yeah,
That's news to me.
It's been
when
around
you
a
say
long-
it's about when you say it's about his court-martial, I think you're thinking of the movie about
Yeah.
Jackie Robinson. Right, right. It's not specifically about his court-martial.
no, there's a movie called The Court-Martial of Jackie Robinson.
That's news to me. Wow,
Yeah.
how about that?
I think
I'll have to
maybe
check
it's a
that out right
TV
away.
movie or something. I do have a question though.
ahead.
I actually have a couple questions. I could ask you questions all night. So I
Well,
actually have an interest.
We'll try to spread it around, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know. So one question I have for you is about Latin American players and how did they like kind of fall into this category? Because I've read a lot of books on the Negro Leagues, and this is my favorite here, Beyond the Shadow of the
Mhm.
Senators is my favorite. Anyway, but there's a lot of, and I'm not really sure I read this, but there was a lot of like players that were almost black
Mhm.
that were in the major leagues, and have you read it? I don't know the details of it. And you, as someone whose
Yeah.
research is,
Yeah.
that, there's some argument that sort of Jackie Robinson isn't the first, modern black player, that there were other players that were, maybe they were called Latin, but they were black
Oh, you
too.
have to separate. Okay, so there's two different things going on here. Three. First of all, you have to separate Latin players from African American players. Okay.
Because of the prejudice was so much different. It was like
No,
you
because
could
those
have dark skin, but you couldn't be African American because that's the way it worked.
Yeah. So I'm separating them because they're two different ethnic groups. That's why
Yes,
I'm
like-
separating. Right. So Latin American players, many of whom looked white, got to play Major League Baseball. There were Latin American players who were playing Major League Baseball all during the color barrier. Those who were darker were often not allowed to play and fell into the same category of exclusion that African American players
Mhm.
played.
That's
There
what I
was,
talking about.
however, a lot of resentment among African American players who were barred from playing Major League Baseball that Latin American players often did get to play. So that was a cause for some resentment. I mentioned that Bud Fowler, who was sort of that in-between range in sort of skin color, but he often had hoped that his skin, if his skin had just been a little lighter, he might have been able to get away as playing as a Latin American. There were some light-skinned African American players, by the way, who were encouraged by some baseball owners to consider trying to play and see if they could fit them in there and call them Latin American. So, it was the
But
whole
none of
thing-
them ever made it. Is that what you're saying?
No, none of them ever made it. But Jackie Robinson was, for all intents and purposes, this is the second African-American player after Moses Fleetwood Walker. There is some research now that says that a guy named Edward Everett White, who was a young freshman at Brown University in the 1870s, may have actually appeared in a game in Providence, Rhode Island, and may be today beginning to be considered possibly the first African-American to play Major League Baseball. But that's not conclusive.
Some of that has to do with what's considered major leagues, right?
No, the major leagues were the major leagues.
Yeah.
I mean, the major leagues were the major leagues. The Toledo Blue Stockings are no longer a major league team, neither were the Providence Grays, but they were then. So that's absolutely
Yeah.
considered playing in the major leagues. If it was a major league
Yeah.
team, it doesn't matter that the major league team no longer exists. It's considered having played in the major leagues. But yeah, no, it's a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of interesting stuff.
Ted, we have a nice comment from Steve, who is talking about an exhibit at Back Bay Station on A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters.
Yes, A. Philip Randolph was the first leader of the Pullman Porters Union, and celebrated figure. Later, became very much a key figure in the civil rights movement. And there is a monument to Philip Randolph at the Back Bay Station. True. Thank you.
Steve also refers people to Studs Terkel's Hard Times for an interview with E.D. Nixon, member of that union and head of the NAACP in Birmingham, where
Great.
Rosa Parks worked with him.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Any other questions?
We have some questions early on. And this is from Dottie, and I think this came up when you were talking about the 143 to 29 season.
Yeah.
Who were the single teams playing to win that many games?
Who were those two teams playing to win that many games? Is that the question?
That's how it's written. Dottie, do you want to
Yeah,
jump
no,
in?
that's fine. That's fine. I mean, I think I understand the gist of it. So obviously, I can't tell you, what the teams were specifically, except to say the majority of them were other Negro League teams and Black professional teams. So they weren't major league teams in the sense that they were on their playing as part of a major league season. However, those include wins against a number of major league teams that played them as part of a barnstorming event, which happened all the time. So among those 143 wins, and I just can't possibly recall what that number is, but within that 143 wins, absolutely includes a number of wins against white major league teams.
Okay.
Definitely.
All right, thank you. So for the early players like Jackie Robinson and Satchel Paige, what was their life like on the road? Were they allowed to stay in hotels with the team or eat with the team? How did that all work?
Well, so when you're talking about the team, you mean when they were with their Negro League team?
No, I mean when they're with the segregated teams.
Right. So in other words, when they're traveling with their Negro League team around the country, right? When I'm sorry, you talking about Satchel Paige and like Josh Gibson?
Yeah. Once they were playing on the Major League Baseball teams.
Oh, I'm sorry. So Josh Gibson never got to the major leagues.
Okay. He
He died before he ever had a chance to get to the major leagues. Satchel Paige did get to the major leagues, and that's something of a gray area, right? So the color barrier falls in 1947. And at that time, there was still a lot of segregation all over the country, right? Don't forget, 1947 is almost 20 years prior to the major civil rights advances of the mid-1960s. So there's still a lot of segregation all over America. And yes, players like Satchel Paige, Monty Irvin, young Willie Mays, young Hank Aaron, they ran into race prejudice all over the country. Even while they were part of a major league team. And there is a celebrated instance of Ted Williams, who, by the way, became a very, very outspoken ally of the Negro Leagues and Black ball players. It was in Ted Williams' induction speech when he entered the Hall of Fame that he really called out for Major League Baseball, had to do more. And it was really on Ted Williams exhorting Major League Baseball to do more for the history of Black baseball that they, came the ultimate creation of the Negro League wing at Cooperstown. But there's a celebrated story where Ted Williams traveling with the Red Sox, and they're playing, I can't remember the name of the team, but the team, so this is in the 1950s, and the other team has a Black ball player. Pitcher's name is Jim Mudcat Grant, who did have a decent major league career, but this is early on. And he, Mudcat Grant arrives late on his own for whatever reason. He's by himself. He comes into the hotel. He goes up to the desk and he says, "I need a room." And the clerk says, "There doesn't seem to be any rooms available." And Ted Williams is walking by right at that time. He recognizes Mudcat Grant and he says to the clerk, "I want to talk to your manager." And the manager comes out and Ted Williams tells the manager that if you don't have a room for this guy, he's taking my room and I'll sleep on the damn cot you're going to give him somewhere in a closet, right? And the manager was very flustered, suddenly magically found a room available for Mudcat Grant. But yeah, no, in answer to your question, sorry, I went on there, but in answer to your question, yeah, for a decade and a half more, those early, former Negro League players who are now playing in the major leagues found segregation all over. Now, it was getting better. It was possible for Satchel Paige, for instance, to go out and eat with, at restaurants in Cleveland. It depended where you were, right? So when Satchel Paige was in New York, when he was in Baltimore, when he was in, Chicago, Cleveland, he generally didn't have any trouble staying where he wanted, eating where he wanted. Unfortunately, it was when they were in the South. It was when they were in even, Cincinnati, never mind further south, that there were problems. That's a great question.
Is there anyone who would like to unmute and ask a question?
I'll ask a question, Sally.
Go ahead, Mark.
Wasn't it Satchel Paige who said, "I'm so fast, I could turn off the switch and be in bed before the light went out"?
That's cool, Papa Bell.
I was
Well, that wasn't.
I was just going to say, that's one of my favorite quotes of Satchel Paige, but he wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about his longtime roommate and teammate, Cool Papa Bell. Exactly right. Whoever said that.
That's
right.
my name, so that's why I said it.
How fast was Cool Papa Bell? And he said, Cool Papa Bell was so fast that once I told him to turn out the lights and he flicked the switch and he was under the covers before the room was dark. So that was, but that's a great quote. I'm glad you brought that up.
It was he when he played in the major leagues, wasn't he over 50 years old?
Well, yes and no. So as with everything else about Satchel Paige, it's complicated. He was in his 40s when he played initially in the major leagues, which is the major league experience we're talking about, when he was signed by first by the Cleveland, the St. Louis Browns, Bill Veeck, and then Veeck signed him again with the Cleveland Indians in 1954 and went to the World Series with Satchel Paige. What you're thinking about, I think, is that he was later signed by the Kansas City Athletics. Then it was a bit of a stunt because he was brought out of retirement so that he could play the requisite. I think he had just number of innings left were in one game. So he was signed by Charles Finley, the owner of the Kansas City Athletics, to play one single game when he was almost 60. And he played that one game so that he could get his innings in and qualify for a major league pension. So yeah, that was extraordinary. And he does hold that record still for the oldest major leaguer in major league history. Anyone else? Well,
I think maybe we should wrap it up.
Yeah.
I want to, on behalf of the Maynard Library and the
because
Randall
pretty soon we're
Library.
going to be in extra innings.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. Yeah, very good, Ted. Thank you.
Yes,
Appreciate
thank
it
you
a
all
lot.
very much, folks. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it, and thank you to the friends. Thank you both the Maynard and the Randall Library in Stowe. I hope the next time we do this, we're able to do it in person.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
good night, Ted.
Thanks, everybody. Good
Good night,
night.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.